as well.
I'm sorry, yep. Yeah, we are recording this, as Stephanie will tell you later. That way it'll be available if you want to go back and review parts of the workshop. As I was saying, these grants are part of the Trust's mission of fostering good stewardship and providing financial investment, for our rich heritage here in New Jersey. Our fund comes from a percentage of the corporate business tax. It's the same pool of money that Green Acres, Blue Acres, and Farmland Preservation use. That's where the Historic Trust funding comes from, as well as CBT funds. Next, please. Actually, this photo is hot off the presses. It's from our December board meeting. As I think many of you know, the Historic Trust Board is made up of 12 citizen members appointed by the governor, as well as 3 ex officio members representing Department of Community Affairs, where the trust is housed, the Department of Environmental Protection, where HPO is, and Department of Treasury. Next, please. Now, these are the folks you'll be dealing with on a regular basis, hopefully. And they'll be the ones who will be managing your grants. You'll meet most of them through, again, they've reached out to you regarding the info packet, but they'll also be reaching out to you managing this open grant. And you'll actually meet most of them, at least virtually today, as part of this webinar. Their contact info is also available on our website, njht.org. So for both phone numbers and email addresses, you'll be able to get that off of our website. Just a real quick update. The governor actually signed the legislation yesterday, so our grants are good to go. We were not biting our nails. We knew it happened, but when it's a lame duck session, you're never sure exactly when it's going to take place. So the legislature passed it last week, and the governor signed it yesterday. So we'll be able to move forward with doing grant agreements and everything that we discussed today. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and again, congratulations on receiving your grant. Stephanie will take over now, giving us an overview.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Kraut, and I am going to start us off with an overview of what we'll be going over today. So this is a webinar, which means that the staff can't see or hear you as attendees. So to communicate, we have access to a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Any questions you have can be typed into that designated section, and we'll address any questions that are entered at the end of each section, as well as at the end of the webinar itself. And we'll be able to answer questions either verbally or we'll put it directly into the Q&A function. Also, just to note, as Glenn said, the presentation will be available on our website and is being recorded. Next slide. So here we have today's agenda. I'm going to first briefly go over the grant agreement process and the grantee info packet and grant manual materials. Then the rest of the trust staff will discuss how we execute the grant agreements, how we define the scope of work, archaeological requirements, if it's applicable to your project, how to administer an active grant, how to close out a grant, and project publicity. And as previously mentioned, there will be time at the end when we can address any remaining questions. Next slide. So the first step in the grantee process is to attend this workshop. Congratulations, you've all successfully accomplished that by being here today, and we are very happy to have you all. The next step as grantees is to submit any supporting documentation in relation to your project and your grantee info packet. After the trust receives that information, we'll assemble those materials and send you 2 original copies of a finalized grant agreement for signature. Once you sign that and follow the procedures laid out in the manual, you'll need to mail that back to us, and we will then send that upstairs to the fiscal office here at DCA, and the grant agreement will be opened and executed. And once the agreement's executed and all reporting documents are submitted by you, you'll be able to submit for reimbursements. Next slide. So there are 2 primary materials for you as grantees. The first is the grantee info packet, which you should have already received in an email from the trust staff earlier this month. This is a crucial document in executing the grant agreement. We can't move forward until this is fully completed and submitted to us. So Please print, fill out, and compile all certifications and resolutions and mail physical copies to the trust by Thursday, March 28th, please. Additionally, we have the grant manual, which is a step-by-step guide outlining the grant agreement process and just reiterating what we explained in this workshop today. This is a really great resource that'll be helpful as you go through the grant process. So please make sure to take advantage of it. Next slide. So that manual is available along with other resources on our webpage, www.nj.gov/dca/njht. On our homepage, there will be a big resources tag at the top of the page, which you can see an example of on your screens now. And if you drop that down, there's a specific for grantee section. If you click on that, there will be different breakdowns depending on your grant type and subcategories with PDF documents of a number of different resources that can be helpful throughout the process. Next slide. And now I'm going to pass it off to Carrie, who will be discussing executing grant agreements.
Hi, thank you. Let's see. Come on, start. There you go. Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie Hogan. I'm the Trust Fiscal Officer. Today, I'll be covering the checklist of documents in your grantee packet, which are needed to draft and execute your grant agreement. We also refer to this as your info packet. So you might hear us say that kind of interchangeably, the grantee packet or info packet. The quicker you get these documents and forms filled out and handed off to your program officer, or PO as we call them, the faster your grant agreement can be drafted and executed. And the trust cannot process any reimbursements without a fully executed grant agreement, something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So the first form in your grantee packet is the checklist. The checklist itself, along with all the items on the checklist, need to be completed and returned to your PO as part of your initial grant agreement package. Please note that the checklist itself and the documents are not your grant agreement. They're simply the essential forms that we use to create the grant agreement contract. After the checklist itself, the first item you need to provide is the letter of acceptance. The second page of the letter of acceptance needs to be filled out completely and signed. By signing the letter of acceptance, you are agreeing to abide by the regulations that govern this grant program, including the requirement to inform your program officer at the trust of all new developments that pertain to your grant project. Your PO should receive copies of all documentation for review and approval before proceeding with any work. Next slide, please. Next on the checklist is the information form. This is a simple form, but critical to creating your grant agreement and needs to be filled out completely. You can see here number 3 on the information form is your vendor ID number. All grantees must be registered with NJ Start, which is the state's mandatory procurement and payment system, to get a vendor number. Registration in NJ Start is quick and easy. It creates an account profile for the grantee so that checks can be issued for approved grant reimbursements. Please make sure that you enter your organization's EIN, employee identification number, and a good email or good mailing address, surface mailing address, to which you will receive your reimbursement checks, and also copies of your grant agreement. The contact person and address that you enter into your NJ Start profile should match the name and address on your grant agreement. So incorrect information entered into NJ Start registration will result in a delay in your execution of your grant agreement. Please note that most county and municipal entities are already in the state's vendor system via their EIN number. However, it's best to contact NJ Start directly to confirm that your preferred address and contact information are all up to date. Again, or else your grant reimbursement check could be delayed and or float around the box to box in a city hall. For the municipalities, you just want to make sure that that information is updated to whomever is running this project for you. There is a helpline that you can see here for getting registered in NJ Start and checking on existing profiles. Please contact the helpline directly with any NJ Start vendor number questions. Also, please note that NJ Start will have an option for you when you sign up for an ACH or automatic payment. These are electronic payments that deposit grant reimbursement funds directly into your organization's designated bank account. So instead of waiting for a paper check to come in the mail, your approved reimbursement moves automatically to your chosen business account. And electing ACH can expedite payments by approximately 2 weeks. So it's a worthwhile endeavor. Okay, next slide, please. Next on your checklist here is your certificate of proof of liability insurance. It's proof of insurance. All grantees must maintain insurance coverage for the entire term of the grant agreement. Grantees must provide a COI Accord certificate, shown here, of insurance to the trust. This is a standard document that insurance companies are really familiar with, and they can easily provide it to you, sometimes same day. So get in touch with your insurance company now and let them know that you need one. It shouldn't take too long for them to provide it to you. Please note that the historic trust must be named as additionally insured in the lower left-hand box of the Accord document. Please also include your project number on the certificate. This way we can match up any subsequent Accord certificates to your project file. Grantees must submit a COI Accord to the trust before the grant agreement can be executed. Missing or incomplete information will again delay the process. Next slide, please. So next is your attachment E, governing body board resolution. This is very important. Your governing body or board needs to pass a resolution certifying the amount of the grant you have been awarded and identify by name the individual authorized to sign the grant agreement on your organization's behalf. The person named in attachment E resolution must be the same individual who ultimately signs the grant agreement. The resolution must have original signatures of the person approving the resolution, as well as the person attesting to the approval. Approved by and attested by should not be the same person. All resolutions should be certified by a government, corporate, or notary seal or stamp. If your board secretary doesn't have an official stamp, you must take your resolution to a notary for certification. And in fact, most nonprofits just go straight to the notary so that there's no question as to whether or not the approval signature is properly certified. Resolutions that are not properly certified will not be accepted, and this will again delay your grant agreement. So please get your resolution on your next governing board meeting agenda so you can knock that out. Next slide, please. So the next slide is the attachment G, statement of adequacy of accounting system. This is your CFO or treasurer must review the requirements of the grant agreement, including state required audits and reporting, and then sign this form. By signing the form, your financial officer is agreeing to be responsible for establishing and maintaining the financial statements for your grant. Your CFO treasurer is also the same person that certifies reimbursement requests and signs all payment vouchers down the road. So please note that your CFO treasurer that signs attachment G cannot be the same person authorized by resolution to execute the grant agreement. This provides the necessary checks and balances of healthy accounting. And that is everything on the preliminary checklist. Next slide, please. Once you've completed all the forms on the checklist, this is again your first step. You'll then surface mail all the documents and forms, including the checklist itself, to your program officer at the trust so they can prepare your grant agreement. 2 copies of the grant agreement will be sent to you for signature and return. Upon return of both signed copies, Glenn Saponis, our executive director, will sign them, and then the trust forwards them to the Department of Community Affairs Fiscal Office to establish an account for payment. Once both original grant agreements are fully executed and signed by all parties, one of the original copies is mailed back to you, the grantee, and one remains here at the trust's office. Please make sure to keep your copy of the grant agreement somewhere safe and easily accessible. This is a living document and should be used by the project contact and team as a guide for compliance, reporting, submitting reimbursement requests, and following mandatory audit guidelines. So that's it for me. Up next is my colleague Shannon Bremer, who will talk about defining a scope of work for her project.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. As Carrie mentioned, my name is Shannon, and I'm going to talk about defining the scope of work for your project. Next slide, please. So our attachment D1, or our scope of work form, is the component in your grant agreement that establishes the project being funded as well as the costs associated with each component of the project. All information in your D1 is based off the scope of work that each of you submitted last spring when you applied for your grant funding. Each program officer will begin drafting the D1s over the coming weeks and then sending them to you for green lighting just to make sure that everything is correct in your D1 so that it's reflected properly in your grant agreement. Then once we have your go ahead and say, everything is correct, we have all of the scope items there, and we have your completed info packet, we'll begin creating your grant agreement. Next slide, please. So I'm going to briefly walk us through each component of our D1, which you can see an example of on the screen. So first we'll list out all the general information about the grant. It's that very first section of the top. So it'll include name of the grantee or who's receiving the funding, the project name, the project number, which has been assigned to you, and then the grant award amount. The first section is the brief history and statement of significance for the site, as well as a short description of the project being funded. Next section establishes the trust as the primary project review authority and describes the review requirements that we have for our grants. In that third section is where we'll list out all of the activities being funded by this grant. So as you can see on the screen, each component of your scope of work is listed separately. So for example, if your scope of work is for a conditions assessment and an archaeological report, they would be listed individually under this section. This allows both you as the grantee and us as the trust to clearly see what deliverables you'll be responsible for at the end of the project. Next slide, please. So under the third section, you'll also find a project budget section, and that'll list the estimated cost for each activity being funded by the grant. All amounts found in the project budget section are based off the submitted proposals that you sent to us from your consultant. The proposal is included as an exhibit in the grant agreement itself as well. For our HSM, Heritage Tourism and Planning grants, they're reimbursed in 2 payments. The first payment is for 80% of the grant amount, and then the second payment will be for that final 20% remaining. That second payment is received upon the closeout of the grant. The dollar amounts that are associated with those reimbursements will be provided to you in your D1 as well. The final component of the D1 is the project schedule, and these are the important dates associated with your project, including the commencement date of your grant agreement, the expiration date of your grant agreement. I recommend that you keep these on hand or posted somewhere you can see them. That way you're aware of all your deadlines and can plan your grant-funded work accordingly so you're not at risk of having any problems later down the road. Next slide, please. So as you can see on the screen, this is going to be the project schedule for our 2023 HSM, Heritage Tourism, and Municipal Planning grants. The schedule is based off the date that the governor signed the appropriation bill, which was yesterday. This date is known as the agreement commencement date. So as you can see, that's reflected as January 16th, 2024. For most of you, January 16th, 2024, or just January 2024, will be considered the work period commencement date. For those that started work prior to this date, we ask that you please provide your program officer with the date that you actually began work so that it can be reflected in your D1. From there, you have 18 months to execute the grant agreement. This is known as the agreement execution date. And you must also begin work within that 18-month period. This is your project commencement deadline. For this grant round, that date is July 16th, 2025. We do recommend that you execute your agreement sooner rather than later, since you cannot receive your initial reimbursement until that grant agreement is fully executed. Your funded project must be completed within 2 years of the agreement commencement date, so that's by January 16th, 2026. And the agreement itself will expire 3 years after the agreement commencement date on January 16th, 2027. This allows you an extra year after the work is completed to get all of your closeout materials prepared and submit those to the trust so that we can get your grant closed out. Extensions on these grants are not assumed and are only advised in extenuating circumstances. They must be requested and then approved by our Grants and Loans Committee. So we encourage working closely with your consultant to ensure that you follow these deadlines and dates as closely as possible, because it may be hard to get an extension if your agreement expires. These dates will also appear in your D1, so don't worry if you don't get a chance to write all of them down now. They will be present in your grant agreement for you to have on hand. Next slide, please. So in addition to defining the scope of work, we also use the D1 to identify your project team. All consultants working on the grant-funded project must be approved by trust staff and must meet our professional qualification standards. If you include resumes and project proposals from consultants in your original application, they are considered approved unless you've been informed otherwise. If you did not include any consultants in your original application, you must submit resumes and project proposals to your program officer and have them approved by the trust before work can begin. If you are unsure if your project team is appropriate or if they have been approved by trust staff, please contact your specific program officer and they'll be able to help make sure that everybody is all set and good to go. When you submit your initial reimbursement request, we do require that you submit a copy of a signed agreement or consultant contract. We will have to have that on file to process your reimbursement. Next slide, please. So real quick, I just want to bring your attention to the trust project requirements for all funded work. All work must meet the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. This is part of your program officer's job to review the submitted work to ensure that it meets those standards. Additionally, consideration of archaeology or the archaeological potential of your site is required for all preservation planning documents. And my colleague Alexis will go into some more detail about archaeology shortly. And finally, all preservation plans and historic structure reports funded by the trust must meet our formatting and content requirements laid out in our preparation guide. It's extremely important that the grantee as well as the consultant are aware of the requirements listed out in the guide, because this is what our program officers use to review any of those documents. There is a checklist of required sections and information within that guide, so we definitely recommend looking that over. The preparation guide can be found on our website under the resources tab in our for grantees section that Stephanie mentioned earlier in this presentation. And if you're having any trouble locating it, just please contact your program officer and they'll be happy to provide you with a PDF copy or the link to its location on our website. Next slide. So finally, the state of New Jersey also has some requirements for our grantees. All of these are laid out in tab 3 of your grant manual. These requirements can be somewhat nuanced and complex, so it's extremely important that your CFO reviews tab 3 of the grant manual in depth to familiarize themselves with the requirements. One of those requirements is the audit requirement. If your organization receives more than $100,000 in state and or federal grants in any given fiscal year, you will be required to submit an audit. While none of your New Jersey Historic Trust grants will be more than $100,000, your organization may be receiving grants from other federal or state entities within a single fiscal year. If those amounts combined exceed $100,000, you will be required to submit an audit. Audit costs are not reimbursable expenses, so your organization will have to budget for the cost of the audit outside of this project. Our grants also have an affirmative action requirement. Our grantees, their consultants, and contractors are required to comply with the state of New Jersey's affirmative action laws. It's especially important that you have the non-discrimination language and policy in any proposals and contracts related to your grant-funded activities. Your consultants are going to be required to show proof of compliance to the State Contract Compliance Unit through the Department of Treasury. There are a few ways they can demonstrate this compliance, and more information regarding that can be found in your grant manual. If you have any specific questions about the affirmative action compliance, they can be directed to the Contract Compliance Unit. And since there are no questions, I'm going to pass things off to Alexis, who's going to talk about our archaeological requirements.
Thanks, Shannon. Hi, everyone. I'm Alexis, and I'm the Trust Staff Archaeologist. I'm going to briefly review the archaeological requirements of trust-funded projects, which are in place to comply with State Historic Preservation Office standards and guidelines. Next slide, please. So first, I want to go over when archaeology is a requirement of your grant funding. Even if the primary goal of your project is not an archaeological investigation, you are required to consider archaeology if you have any ground disturbing activities planned. I won't read this full list, but some examples of the kinds of activities that have required archaeological consideration in past trust projects include the excavation of trenches for utility service and site drainage, excavation related to ADA site improvements, and the construction or expansion of walkways, driveways, and parking areas. If you have broad-scale site improvements planned for your site now or in the future, we strongly recommend that you consider the preparation of an archaeological management plan, which, similar to a preservation plan, will offer guidance for overall preservation efforts, address specific archaeological needs, and ensure that future activities consider and maybe even avoid potential effects to archaeological resources. Next slide, please. So at this point in the process, you should have already considered archaeology and come up with a plan for addressing it if needed. Your next step toward fulfilling the archaeological requirements for your project should be to select a qualified professional archaeologist and involve them in your project early on so they can help ensure that archaeological resources are being taken into account appropriately and are being handled effectively. Keep in mind that an archaeological evaluation will need to be completed before any other ground disturbance. It's a good idea to handle the archaeological component of your project early in case any activities requiring ground disturbance need to occur that you hadn't planned on, such as soil survey that might require trenching or probing, or in case something is discovered that might necessitate some alterations to your plans. And if you're unsure whether your current project plans require archaeology or how to select an archaeologist, please don't hesitate to contact myself or your program officer so we can discuss the specifics of your project in more detail. Next slide, please. So you might be asking, what if ground disturbance isn't a part of my current project? You'll still be required to consider the archaeological potential of your site in all planning documents. We want to see that you've considered the archaeological potential of your site and what your plans would be for addressing any archaeological concerns that may arise in the future. This might be as simple as stating if any ground disturbance is to occur, a professional archaeologist will be consulted prior to excavation, but it might also be as comprehensive as enlisting an archaeologist to prepare a chapter for a preservation plan, or even to complete an archaeological management plan for the site. Some of this will depend on the current and long-term goals you have for the site, and that's something that you are more than welcome to discuss with your program officer and myself if needed. As you consider how you might incorporate archaeology into your planning documents, it might be beneficial to consider whether any of your goals may require archaeology as you envision the long-term stewardship of your site. For example, you might foresee wanting to make improvements to the foundations of one of the buildings or to eventually add visitor amenities such as a bathroom. These activities are just two examples of future projects that may eventually require the consideration of archaeology. And with a plan in place now and considerations made in advance, you could save time and money down the road. You may also have research questions that can only be answered by archaeology that would further enrich the knowledge you have about the history of your site and its occupants. This is another consideration for the future, and not to mention the public engagement opportunity that an archaeological investigation might present. Next slide, please. While the scientific value of what you might uncover archaeologically is invaluable on its own, archaeology also has the added benefit of just being interesting. Taking the opportunity to share the archaeology at your site with the people who visit and love it serves as an excellent avenue for increasing public engagement. We've seen a number of successful public archaeology projects here at the Trust where the public have been invited to not only observe the archaeology taking place on site, but also to participate in it. Depending on the scope of archaeological investigation you'll be undertaking, archaeology can be used as a training opportunity as well, allowing for collaboration with local professional archaeologists and universities to build mutually beneficial partnerships that might broaden your network, as well as serve the next generation of archaeologists by offering them excavation experience. And on top of all of these wonderful benefits, archaeology can give new insight into your site and add to your understanding of its use and development over time, as well as provide you with artifacts to display and interpret from your own grounds. And as always, if you have any questions at all about archaeology, please feel free to reach out to myself or to your program officer. And with that, I'll hand it over to Vito, who's going to review how to administer an active grant.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vito Scacozo, one of the program officers here at the Historic Trust. So to get us started here with administering an active grant, all of this information can be found in detail, along with many answers to questions you might have in your grant manual. This is always available on our website, which we'll talk about a little bit later. I want to go ahead and jump to the next slide, please. So the biggest thing about administering an active grant is communication with the trust. Communication within this grant program really is key to a successful project. So you might be wondering, when should you be communicating with us? And some examples of that are here on the slide. You should be sending to your program officer drafts of any planning documents that are funded by the grant, or even if they're not funded, you should be sharing with them so we can make sure there might not be any conflicts with what is funded by the grant project. contracts with consultants that are preparing grant-funded products, and quarterly reports and reimbursement requests as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then communication at closeout, you'll also need to provide us with final approved grant-funded documents, such as 2 hard copies and 1 digital copy of any work product, as well as a final report and a reimbursement request. Crucial to communication is knowing who your program officer and your staff contacts are. And if you have any questions or problems, you have good news, just a groundbreaking event or something else going on that you'd like trust involvement, we're here, whether it's by call or email. Feel free to reach out to us. We do want to let you know that if you do not have a consultant selected yet, please review and submit their information to us to ensure that they meet the federal qualification standards set by the Secretary of the Interior. And if you have project meetings or would like attendance or participation in meetings, please let us know, and especially keep us in the loop if there are potential changes with your scope of work or with who your contractor or consultant may be. I'd like to jump to the next slide. So as mentioned on the previous slide, part of your communication with the trust is submitting quarterly reports. These reports are due quarterly, 4 times per year, and the dates are listed here, April 15th, July 15th, October 15th, and January 15th. So after execution of your grant agreement in this coming spring, April 15th will be your first quarterly report submission. These quarterly reports are in your grant agreement, as you can see in this example page on the right in section C. So you'll be submitting attachment C1 following the checklist of items, which include a narrative, a team list, a project schedule, any submissions that you may have at this time, and certification that your report is accurate. If you are not submitting a reimbursement request, you can go ahead and submit these quarterly reports via email. If you are submitting for reimbursement, you have to submit it in paper via postal delivery, as the payment vouchers and the reimbursement request paperwork must have original signatures. Even if there's no active project activity, such as by this April 15th date, if you haven't yet started your project, still send a report via email just to get in the habit of filling out this paperwork and moving things forward. Something just as simple as a quick email with a quickly filled out document, that's more than sufficient at that time. I want to go ahead and jump to the next slide. So for reimbursement requests for HSM, Heritage Tourism, and MCRP grant projects, there are going to be 2 reimbursements. Your initial reimbursement will be for 80% of your grant award, while your final reimbursement will be for 20%. Your initial reimbursement request must include a signed consultant contract, if not previously submitted as part of your application, as well as an initial retainer or invoice that is paid. Please attach that invoice and proof of payment from your financial institution, such as a canceled check. We can't accept screenshots or just written signatures. We need an official proof of payment from your financial institution. As well as with the proof of payment, we also need the state payment voucher. We cannot reimburse you without this payment voucher, as seen on the right here. It requires the original signatures of the designated CFO in the grant agreement, who is designated as the signee of these documents. Payment takes approximately 3 weeks after the receipt of these documents, so make sure that everything is also correct and submitted the first time so that there's no further delays in that reimbursement process. And as Carrie had previously mentioned, registering for direct deposit in the state's ACH system can greatly expedite this payment process. And that 20% final reimbursement will be at the closeout of the grant after the approval of all documents and grant-funded products. You can go ahead and jump to the next slide. So before anything can be considered final, it must be reviewed by the trust. So you should be submitting work products to the trust in draft form for review and comment, such as planning documents, construction drawings, ordinances, whatever our grant is funding, we should be reviewing. You should allow at least 4 weeks for review. In some cases, this could be faster. In some cases, it may be longer. That'll be a discussion that you can have with your program officer as the project develops. And lastly, the final work product may be produced after any trust comments have been incorporated. And as previously mentioned, for that closeout, we're going to need 2 printed final copies as well as 1 digital copy submitted to the trust before the closeout of the grant. You can go ahead and jump to the next slide. And then there's also the possibility of amending the grant agreement if there's a major change in plans. Hopefully that your constant communication with your program officer can help predict or help prepare to stop any of these changes if not necessary. So communication can really get ahead of the game with this. But in the instance that you do need to amend the grant agreement, such as there's a major change to your project schedule, you need to change your scope of work, or you need to change your consultant or contractor for your project, those are things that we can have a discussion and get moving for you. To request these changes, you'll have to submit attachment D2 from your grant agreement, which is the request for major change. You should be completing this request before the end of the work period or grant agreement deadline, not waiting until after things have already expired. All of these requests are reviewed by our Grants and Loans Committee and then finalized by our board. So that'll happen also on a quarterly basis. Extensions and changes to your grant agreement are not guaranteed, so please be sure to provide sufficient evidence to justify your request for altering your grant agreement. And as stated here on this slide, as well as in the grant agreement, the general terms and conditions of the grant agreement are non-negotiable. I believe that is it for me. Next up, my colleague Jennifer will talk about the closeout process for the grant agreement.
Hi everyone, I'm Jennifer, and I will briefly discuss the closeout process. So while it may be some time before anyone here closes out their grant, it's still important now to go through the process. Grant closeout can occur after the trust has reviewed and approved all work to date, and the process is very important because you will not receive the remaining balance of your grant until you submit completed closeout paperwork. And let me repeat, you will not receive the remaining balance of your grant until your closeout paperwork and final deliverables are submitted and approved by the trust. Next, please. For historic site management, heritage tourism, and MCRP grants, you must submit all final deliverables from your approved scope of work items to your program officer at the trust. This includes preservation plans, National Register nominations, copies of ordinances, whatever it is, it needs to be submitted in hard copy and digital formats for your closeout process. And your program officer will review these documents and give the final approval. In addition to submitting your final work products, you will also need to complete the C2 form included with your grant agreement. The C2 form is the final reimbursement request and report. Please follow the itemized checklist on this form. Items included in the checklist include a brief project narrative and copies of all invoices and canceled checks or proof of payments that were not part of your initial reimbursement request. We also need a payment voucher included with your grant agreement with an original signature in blue or red ink from your CFO. And I cannot stress this enough, please follow the itemized checklist on your C2 form. If anything is left out, it will delay your final reimbursement. And once everything is submitted and approved, your program officer will then be able to file the paperwork for the disbursement of the final 20% of your grant award. And if you want more information about the closeout process, please consult Chapter 4 of your grant manual. And as always, if you have any questions or concern, please call or email us. And now Ashley will go through publicizing your projects.
Many of you are still tuned in, so I just wanted to begin by saying thank you for hanging in there. We're in the home stretch, and you received a lot of information this afternoon. So once again, my name is Ashley Parker. I am the Heritage Tourism Program Coordinator here at the Trust, and today I will be going over how publicity can play an important role in your project. For those of you following along with the grant manual, this is section 4, page 4.2. Next slide, please. So publicity helps maintain visibility of your project and organization during the preservation campaign. It can also increase attendance or membership for programs and activities. and can also attract new funding support and additional resources. Next slide. So publicizing your project also promotes and raises awareness of history and historic preservation in New Jersey. This helps ensure ongoing funding for historic preservation. So good publicity opportunities are grant award announcements and check presentations, project milestones such as groundbreaking or ribbon cutting ceremonies, tours, special events, or profiles for volunteers, staff, or special craftsmen, or letters to your legislatures and representatives. These opportunities can be achieved by news or journal articles about your project, social media posts, or special televised news coverage. If you're interested in coordinating a check presentation or grant award announcement, please contact your program officer. We will be more than happy to coordinate with you to organize the event, and we can extend the invitation to our Board of Trustees, as well as bring a large check for presentation that looks great in photos. Next slide, please. So additionally, your site might be eligible for inclusion on Journey Through Jersey, which is the state's go-to website for all things heritage tourism that was launched by the Trust in 2017. The website features heritage tourism destinations throughout the state, in addition to annual events, educational resources, blog posts, and travel itineraries, which are also featured on Journey Through Jersey's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We also host unique educational opportunities for Journey Through Jersey site managers. For instance, for the past 2 years, 10 Journey Through Jersey participants received complimentary registration to the Travel and Tourism Conference. And we are also working with a consultant on a multi-year marketing campaign. So we highly encourage you to nominate your visitor-ready site to the website in order to publicize your resource for free. So you will receive a welcome packet upon joining that will include a window decal and postcard with QR codes that link visitors directly to the website. The only thing we ask in return as a participating resource is that you include the Journey Through Jersey logo with the link to the website on your organization's homepage. And if you'd like to learn more about Journey Through Jersey, or would like to be featured, or interested in writing a blog post, please contact me directly. My contact information can be found at the end of this presentation and on the Trust's website. Next slide, please. So help us help you promote your project by staying in touch with us. The Trust is active on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So we encourage you to tag us in posts, send us news coverage, progress photos, events, or any other content that you would like us to share. There are no guarantees, but we do try to post as much as we can. We also kindly ask that you reshare our posts and link to our website in order to help us raise awareness about funding opportunities as well as historic preservation in New Jersey. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to turn my presentation over to my colleague, Kristen. If there are any questions that you'd like to pop into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen before we end this afternoon's workshop.
Thank you, Ashley. As of right now, we don't have any. I'm not sure if you want to give it a second, see if anyone wants to do any late submissions. As of right now, no open questions.
I know our team did a great job today, but boy, no questions. That's a first. Well, if we're not, well, here we go.
Okay, so Lynn asks, our org doesn't have a CFO. Would the person who handles billing count as CFO, or should I just stick with my treasurer?
I guess I'll take this. I mean, treasurer is fine. It's whoever's in charge of fiscal responsibilities with the organization. Typically, it is either a CFO or treasurer. So again, it's that same person who'll be signing that attachment G as part of your grant agreement, who understands your fiscal responsibilities of the grant. So we often see a treasurer listed in that case.
Okay, so we have one from Joseph. Is March 28th the deadline for returning the initial checklist items or executing the grant agreement?
I'll take this one. So that March 28th deadline is for returning the grantee info packet, which you should have received via email a couple of weeks ago. So that's going to be that info sheet that Carrie went over earlier, the board resolution, your insurance certificate, as well as that attachment G that Glenn just talked about briefly with your CFO or treasurer's signature.
The grant agreement itself deadline is 18 months from yesterday, which we hope you don't take that much time to complete your and executing a grant agreement. Hopefully it's done much sooner than that.
Okay. Allison would like to know, where do we find their program officer?
So I can take this one too. So your program officer should have been identified in your initial award letter that you should have received in September or October. It was also identified in your grantee info packet, and they should have also been copied on the email that you received with your info packet, a link to the manual, as well as the information in your workshop. Questions, still you can feel free to reach out to us directly, Allison, to get you connected with them.
Okay, and we have another question. Where can everybody access this recorded webinar after it's completed?
So the webinar will be uploaded onto the Trust website. It will be found underneath that resources tab, followed by grantee resources. An email will also be circulated with all of the attendees from today. So it does take a few days to process the recording, so just bear with us, but it should be available by Monday, the latest.
Thank you, Ashley. As of right now, we have no more open questions.
All right, then. Again, we all appreciate you guys joining in today to go through this presentation. I know it's a lot in front of you, but once we get the grant agreement signed and you start interacting with your program officers, we're here to help you make this a very positive experience with our grants, and hopefully it'll lead to more future grants as well. So again, we thank you for joining us, and we will be in touch.